The Russian and Ukrainian ambassadors to the United Nations are sparring over their commitment towards humanitarian corridors. Humanitarian corridors are temporary demilitarized zones in areas where civilians are caught in a war zone. They are usually set up when a city or town is under siege. The idea is to halt hostilities for a certain time to allow the safe evacuation of civilians along designated routes, or to allow urgent humanitarian aid to reach civilians who stay behind. Usually, humanitarian corridors are negotiated by a third party not involved in the fighting, like the United Nations or other aid agencies. But sometimes they're set up by local groups and all parties in an armed conflict must agree to them. The term humanitarian corridor was first used during the Bosnian War in the 1990s, when the UN set up safe areas for civilians. But the attempt was seen as a failure since the UN was unable to protect the zones when they came under attack. Humanitarian corridors were employed in the Syrian civil war. However, Russian and Syrian forces were often accused of breaking ceasefires surrounding humanitarian corridors with the continued bombing of besieged cities. In Ukraine, the previous two attempts to evacuate citizens from besieged areas failed. Both Moscow and Kiev traded accusations for its failure. Russia has now proposed to open humanitarian corridors from 6 Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv, Kiev, and Mariupol. But Ukraine has called Moscow's plan for humanitarian corridors completely immoral, after reports suggested that most of the routes led directly to Russia or its ally Belarus. It wants its citizens to be allowed to evacuate towards the western city of Lviv instead. Meanwhile, humanitarian corridors have just opened for Sumy and Mariupol. Nearly 1,000 foreign students have been evacuated from Sumy, but in the besieged city Mariupol, Ukrainian authorities have accused Russia of ceasefire violation as evacuations were underway.